Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Aaron Porras, and today we return to Iran, the Islamic Ayatollah regime inaugurating its newest, most extreme president yet, while continuing to expand its terror across the region and to stall nuclear talks in Vienna.
לפני מספר ימים נשיא חדש, ראיסי, התליין מטהרן, שהוא אדם אכזרי וקיצוני אפילו במונחי המשטר האיראני. אנחנו רואים עלייה בתוקפנות האיראנית בכל נקודה במזרח התיכון, ביבשה, באוויר ובים. הלא איראן הפילה מטוס אזרחי ותקפה ספינה אזרחית, תוך הרג אזרחים ממגוון מדינות ברחבי העולם. המשטר האיראני מפעיל טרור על נתיבי התחבורה הבינלאומיים. איראן מהווה סכנה ברורה ליציבות האזור, לשלום העולם, ואסור שהעולם ישלים עם זה. האיראנים צריכים להבין שאי אפשר להמשיך להשתולל בלי לשאת במחיר.
Joining us to discuss is former senior advisor for global public affairs at the United States State Department and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Digital Strategy, Len Khodorovsky, and then professor of political science at Columbia University and at Tel Aviv University, and former Deputy National Security Advisor, Dr. Chuck Freilich. Thank you both so much for joining us. Now, Dr. Freilich, I'm actually going to start with you. CIA Director Bill Burns arriving in Israel to discuss potential alternatives to the JCPOA nuclear deal, like a freeze on the program in returns for easing sanctions. But is this too little too late? Defense Minister Gantz is asserting that Iran is less than 10 weeks away from a bomb to begin with.
Iran isn't 10 weeks away from a bomb. Iran may be something like that from having enough fissile material for a first bomb. That doesn't yet give them an operational capability. They still have to be able to put it on a missile, on a warhead, and they're a good year and a half or 2 years away from that capability. So yes, the rate of enrichment is very concerning, but we still have time before they actually have a bomb. Mr. Burns, the CIA director, is here now because the prospects of a return to the JCPOA, or the nuclear deal, are indeed looking increasingly doubtful. And alternatives have to be discussed. This is an issue which already came up between the U.S. and Israel a few months ago. Israel was skeptical at the time whether a deal could be reached or not. And it's good that we are talking about the alternatives now because we may be there or very soon. And one possibility that's been mentioned, and exactly the one that you noted, is that there might be a more, not quite a deal, not even a limited deal, but some sort of partial agreement where Iran agrees to, let's say, freeze what it's done in place, and it's essentially withdrawn from the agreement in exchange for only partial lifting of the sanctions, as opposed to a complete lifting, which would be part of a real nuclear deal.
Well, so, I mean, they're also set to discuss certain coordinations and cooperations on Iran. Could you expand maybe on what that might mean in addition to this potential deal that we just discussed?
Well, I presume that it would refer to a whole variety of issues, such as measures to help delay the nuclear program. There have been repeated cases of sabotage of the Iranian nuclear facilities, unknown who did them, but of course there's speculation in that regard. There have also been a number of attacks in recent months and in the last year or two, Iranian attacks on shipping. There have been, during the recent fighting with Hamas in Gaza, the Iranians fired an unmanned aerial vehicle at Israel. They continue their efforts to build up their own military presence in Syria, to strengthen Hezbollah in Syria, and especially to transfer precision capabilities to Hezbollah, primarily in Lebanon. So there are a whole variety of issues, also Iranian attacks on American forces in Iraq and elsewhere. So there's a lot to talk about, and Iran has a new president as of the last few days, Mr. Raisi, who may actually not be the most radical of Iran's presidents. I'm not sure that Ahmadinejad was any better, but certainly not a great improvement in terms of Iran's policy.
All right, Len, I want to bring you into the conversation. Prime Minister Bennett, he added that now is the time for action and not just statements. Western powers, including the United States and in Europe, including Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, vowing to respond harshly against Iran's recent attacks, as we mentioned, in the Gulf of Oman and elsewhere in the region in the Middle East. Do you see a real response actually happening that has a bite to it against Iran at the risk of endangering the JCPOA? Do you see the United States or any other Western power really undergoing or undertaking such an act?
I don't. I fear that the Biden administration has unfortunately surrendered all the leverage that it has inherited from Trump administration, and it's hard for me to explain why, because even if they don't agree with our policy, it would have been wise of them to use the leverage to get the longer and stronger deal that both President Biden and Secretary Blinken have discussed in tuning their Iran policy. So what we've seen over the last few months is the more provocative the Iranian regime has been, the more concessions seemingly we've been hearing about from Vienna, from the Biden administration. So I don't think that they're going to risk at this point, at this late juncture, sabotaging the deal that they're so desperately wanted to get back into. The only kinetic response and the only real deterrence that we might see in the coming days and weeks will probably be from Israel, because it has the most to lose.
Just as a follow-up, I mean, I know that Iran is in a severe economic crisis amongst other crises with coronavirus, et cetera. The currency alone has fallen 1,000 points in recent days. It's the lowest point that it's been all year. Might this actually sway Raisi to join the deal, or will it push him away from the deal, make him take a more hardline position? How might the situation in Iran actually influence Raisi to come back to the deal? Maybe the sanctions are working. Could the United States maybe just stay the course with these sanctions?
Well, the maximum pressure campaign was at its optimal squeeze in January when the Biden administration took over. It has gradually been eased over the last few months in a number of what have been called good faith measures from the Biden administration. So they're not feeling the pinch that they felt early in the year. The other point is that, it's not really Raisi that's going to make the call on going back into the deal. It's going to be Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. And I think he's probably made the calculation that he can keep going with escalating the attacks on American interests and on American allies in the region. And, it's paid off up until now. And I think he can play that game, going forward. Until a point where the deterrence from either the Americans or the Israelis or any of the allies who have anything to lose will become so high that his strategy is no longer worth it, which I don't see happening, because I think the United States and the Europeans are in many ways desperate to get back into the deal. Certainly the Russians and the Chinese don't care to support the national security of the United States and our European allies. So they're going to do everything they can to ensure that Iran gets the most out of this deal. So I think the picture is bleak, and I don't see Raisi feeling the pinch that that's going to make him do anything other than what they've been doing the last few months.
Okay, well, so Dr. Freilich, back to you. Coming off of what Len actually just said in terms of the various interests of the P5+1 powers and the other powers involved in the JCPOA with Iran, the United States and Western powers are accusing Iran of basically attacking international transportation lanes. How much is too much? At what point do they interfere with Russian and Chinese interests enough to get them involved as the Americans and Europeans are involved?
Well, the Russians and the Chinese aren't the targets of these attacks, so their motivation to get involved is not particularly great.
So it needs to be direct attack? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know if a direct attack, but Iran is an ally of both of the two countries, a long-standing strategic ally of Russia's, and a long-time source of energy for for China. And in the last year, or just a few months ago, Iran and China signed a major strategic agreement. We don't quite know the details, but it looks like a real breakthrough agreement that includes military cooperation, cyber cooperation, and other areas of commercial cooperation, which are fine. Huge quantities of oil as part of the deal. So they don't have an interest in getting involved here. And I don't see any of them taking kinetic action on that. I must say I agree completely with Len, and I've long been of the view that in the final analysis, I don't think we're there yet, but when push comes to shove, when we reach the crunch, Israel will ultimately be alone facing Iran, and then we may have to make some very, very difficult choices. I would like to say, however, that I don't know of any American sanctions that have been lifted in recent months. Mm-hmm. All of the sources of leverage are still there. There is certainly a problem here if as part of going back to the old deal, the U.S. does have to forego those sources of leverage. That is a big problem. The Biden administration has taken the approach, and on this I think they're right, that, well, they either go back to the old deal or there won't be any deal at all. And that is, I think, the worst of all worlds for all sides, certainly from an Israeli perspective. That's my view. The problem, though, is that then if you've done that, if you have given up your leverage to go back to the old deal, how do you incentivize the Iranians to agree to the follow-on deal, which is not in their interest? And that's very hard to do. So there's a real catch here. What's the best way of going about it? I'm one of those who still believes that going back to the old deal is the best of the bad options.
You really believe that going back to the old deal is still possible? Wouldn't Iran not only have to make major concessions, they'd have to disassemble, it seems like, a lot of their current infrastructure. Are they anywhere near willing to do that?
Well, I don't think they have to make major concessions. It's actually the U.S. which is going to have to make the greater ones. They have to reverse steps, many of which are relatively easily reversible. Some are not, in the sense that it's know-how that they've gained, and once they have it in their minds, that is irreversible. But they can go back to it. The problem for them isn't the technical one, it's a political one. You have even more hardliners in power than the hardliners who were there until now. Mr. Raisi in particular. And the hardliners in Iran, from their perspective, believed that they were justified. All of their fears were justified. They had said at the time, before the JCPOA was signed, that the U.S. was not a trustworthy partner, that it would renege on its promises. And in fact, that is what happened in 2018 without any factual justification, in the sense that not even the CIA claimed that Iran was in violation of the agreement. It wasn't. So for the Iranians to now agree to go back to the deal is a political problem. It's an issue of face saving. I don't know if we can still go back to the deal. I just always like to look at the alternatives, not what I would like, but what is really realistic. And I think of the bad options, and all the options we face are bad, it is still the best of them, and I hope we can do it.
Len, how do you respond?
Well, I think some of the unfortunate steps over the last few months to allow the Iranian regime some breathing room have been giving them access to some frozen funds, I believe in South Korea, and I believe at least one or two other places. Some of the designations on specific people have been lifted. you have seen some of the components of the maximum pressure campaign eased in a number of ways, and I suspect that was to keep Iran at the table. Instead of meeting these concessions with concessions, the Iranian regime has actually increased its belligerence. So, I think, whether the JCPOA 2.0 is the best of the bad options, I personally disagree with. I think more maximum pressure is a better option. I think, you mentioned earlier the economic squeeze that the regime has felt over the last 4 years increasingly, that have produced demonstrations on the street, that have, forced the regime essentially to lose all of its legitimacy among the population. And I think the installment of Raisi as president is probably an acknowledgement of some of that. That the Ayatollah Khamenei no longer feels like he needs to play the game of putting a quote unquote moderate in charge of Iran, that put a softer, smilier face at the head of the government. I think is an acknowledgement that at this point it's just the regime in the bunker by itself, and it's going to force the population to accept whatever policies it chooses to move forward with. Look, I mean, since 1979, we've had the most turbulence in Iran over the last few years that have caused the regime to feel, to feel like it's actually vulnerable. And the only card it had left in its deck was the election of a new American president that would hopefully reverse some of those pressures. And in some ways, they won the lottery in that respect. And so they're going to play. They're going to play their cards at this point. They're going to. I don't think they see. It's a win-win scenario for them in many ways. China is going to keep buying their oil, and Russia is going to keep selling them weapons. So I think they're in many ways they're strengthened by what's happened over the last few months.
All right. So, Dr. Freilich, I want to go back to you then. Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, the president of Iran, in his first phone call with a Western leader, he spoke with President from France, Emmanuel Macron, and he said that in order to get back to the JCPOA, the rights of the Iranian nation must be secured and guaranteed. What do you think he means by that?
I think he means a couple of things. First of all, they want to see the various forms of American and other pressure relieved. And I think what they're really most concerned about is that Biden or some future president could withdraw from the agreement a second time. They've asked the U.S. for some sort of guarantee, and the U.S. has said, look, we can only give you our own personal, this administration's guarantee. We can't put anything in writing. We can't, legally under American law, we can't bind a future administration. So I think that's what they're concerned about. But I would like to go back for a moment to the issue of the extreme pressure policy. I'm all for exerting the maximal pressure, I'm all for exerting pressure on Iran. The maximal pressure policy did not produce any positive changes in Iran's policies. If anything, what they did is snub their nose at the U.S. and continue and strengthen their violations and provocations. Now, it is conceivable that if Mr. Trump had gained another 4 years in office, maybe after 4 or 6 or maybe another 10 years of these pressures, they would have produced the desired outcome. They did not as of the 2-year point, which is about when Mr. Trump left office. We also know that at an earlier stage, back in 2012, during the negotiations leading up to the deal in 2015, when they were under very severe pressure at the time, similar to what was there at this point, the economic pressure was not enough to get them to cave in or to make major concessions. It was enough to force them to the table and to get them to make some significant concessions, but not to give up the nuclear program completely. Now, it would be nice if we could keep the pressure in place, but the objective wasn't to cause them pain, it was to get them to change their policies. So far, that hasn't worked. They've created what they call the resistance economy, all sorts of measures that enable them to weather the external economic pressures. They're manufacturing all sorts of things domestically that they didn't do in the past. They've signed this deal with China that we already mentioned. They have found a way to live with the economic pressure. And yes, there are all sorts of signs of domestic discontent. This isn't new in Iran. Some of it is a little bit more than we've seen in the past. But any attempt to try and say that we can rely on economic pressure to solve the problem or greatly alleviate the problem, that is optimistic. There is no indication so far that that's the case. And the danger, I mean, I'm all for it if we think it can work, if we really think it can work. But I think we're rapidly reaching a point where it's either going to be military action or a deal. Those are really the only two realistic options that we seem to face for the foreseeable future, at least.
All right, well, it sounds like we're more or less back where we started, either military action or a deal. Very tough choices either way. At any rate, thank you so much, Dr. Chuck Freilich and Len Kodorovsky, for joining us. I'm Aaron Porras, and please tune in next time on Insider for more on everything Israel. If there's a topic that you'd like us to cover next, let us know about it in the comments online. And finally, for more news from Israel, follow ILTV on Facebook and on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and ILTV.tv channels. Thank you so much. Be well. We'll see you soon.